And now we have a brief announcement from Jackie Thomas.
I hope everybody enjoyed their lunch, which kind of brings me to what I wanted to discuss, a presentation towards two people that are totally amazing, awesome, great, that have been doing this for the last 3 or 4 years, or I've known for 4 years. So, but Melissa, where are you? Come here, please. And Susan, I would like to present you with hoodies. Yes, you get the swag from Munsee. Susan. These two ladies have done so much in the last 5 years, and they are so awesome at organizing and everything. Just give them all a round of applause.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Dorman, and I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library. It's really wonderful to be able to collaborate with Suzanne and Melissa and everybody to welcome people here to the library in Princeton, New Jersey. It feels especially appropriate, given that we're in a library, to have this session on Lunaape Books. We're really, really excited about it. We have 4 panelists who will be speaking, and the first of which, I think everybody sort of prefers to introduce themselves, but the first 2 presenters are McCallum and Kasimir Chupik-Hall to talk about their forthcoming graphic novel on Arnold Logan. Please join me in welcoming them both.
I guess I should introduce myself again if there's new people in the crowd. My name's McCallum. I'm a member of Munsee Delaware Nation, and it's my pleasure to co-present the Most Perfect Specimen upcoming book with my friend Kasimir Chupik-Hall, who's been the artist. So I'll let her introduce.
Hi, I'm Kasimir. I'm a 4th-year student at Emily Carr, and I'm very excited to be working on this super long-term project with Ian.
Kasimir hit the piece right on the head, so to speak. It's been a long-term project, and I skipped some slides because I'm going to show you exactly how long this has been. He hasn't had to put up with it as long as I have. There's 2 people in the room who've known the struggle personally of trying to write this piece of work since I was 18 years old. So I'm going to draw your attention to 18-year-old me. Back in 1991, I was tasked with creating a rather boring history fair project as part of your grade 13 history year. It was something every kid had to do. You couldn't get out of it. And I dislike building models, of things with your hands, because I'm not very good at it. So 18-year-old me was pretty saucy, and I didn't want to do this. I'm very good at research. I love to look into history and things like that, but don't ask me to build anything. So while other kids are bringing massively wonderful 3D projects to bear on History Fair, I bring in this little carved piece of wood that I painted and sanded, so I did that at least, and I basically took a copy of the tombstone that's out at Munsee Delaware Nation in honor of a man I never met, who died literally 60 years before I was born. I found him to be very interesting. I found this tombstone to be very interesting because it's quite elaborate. So out in the middle of rural southwestern Ontario, there is a rather elaborate tombstone in the cemetery at Munsee, Delaware, with a soldier statue on top. Right, it stands out. Or I'm sorry, it's obscured by forest, but it stands out. And so I found out a lot about him having to do this grade 13 history fair project. Did I mention my dad's a history teacher? Okay, so there's pressure to bear. My mom's a teacher, so there's pressure to bear that you do a good job. I found out a lot about my great uncle Arnold doing this research, and this is back in the 1990s. So he actually had to mail away for stuff. It wasn't just a one click and you found stuff out. I'm a very reluctant writer. I don't feel that I have a capability in that area. If you ask me to churn out an essay for university, I'm very good at that. But using a creative side to me was a struggle. And so over 35 years, I have tried to write Uncle Arnold's story because there isn't one. And research has changed over 35 years, where no longer am I writing to the Library and Archives Canada for my great uncle's war records. You can get those online now. Plus, you can get all these photos and research about, you know, where the 1st Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force went. You can really sort of put pieces together for a story. So time has changed. Progress has changed, I guess. And what Kasimir and I are going to do are going to sort of share like the very briefest tidbits of this story, because it is not yet published, but we thought we could share with you some of the work that we've done together to try and bring this story to light. This picture here is of, it's in August 1914 in St. Thomas, Ontario. And if you're not familiar with St. Thomas, Ontario, it's known as the Railway City because there's lots of railways there, or there were lots of railways there. It's also known for the last place Jumbo the elephant was ever alive. So if you go to St. Thomas, there is a is it a life-size? I guess it's in death life-size picture, or sorry, statue of Jumbo the elephant in town. At the courthouse in August 1914, the first 100 soldiers in all of Elgin County, and among the first in all of Canada, signed up for service. And my great uncle Arnold is in the 3rd row from the top, and he's the 5th in holding a helmet. So the men, we have a photo. That's him. That's right, Jen. Which is significant because a lot of the family records were burned in a house on the reserve. So a lot of his letters and a lot of his pictures were unfortunately lost in a fire in the 1980s. So this picture gives us an actual visual of Arnold, but it also shows the group of people that he signed up with originally back in 1914. Okay. Now we're going to tempt fate here. We have spiced up the presentation with a few clips of sort of a documentary about Arnold. There are clips of the actual story that that we've created. So here's Tempting Fate.
Guarding the Town, August 1914.
I'll preface this by saying you get my narration. I don't think Arnold sounded like me. Arnold was an 18-year-old from Munsee, Delaware. He spoke both Munsee, he spoke English. He went to Mount Elgin Residential School. He worked on the railway, so I don't know if he sounds like a 53-year-old man in 2025. Sadly, you're going to get my narration of the story, but what I'd love for you to do is just take a look at the wonderful artwork that goes with this, but also maybe parts of the story that we've used to try and, I guess, give Arnold his story back.
Guarding the Town, August 1914. Since joining, the sergeant is putting us to work as soldiers. We have been marching daily, sometimes as far as 5 miles out in the countryside. This catches the attention from farmers and passerbys. We've been doing drill 3 times a day, learning from Sergeant Prowse on how to be soldiers. Some of us had to guard the electric plant and waterworks from enemy attack. I don't think this is going to happen. I'm surrounded by friends, so many of us have left jobs on the railway to join up.
So part of the writing process, the research has provided names of people that Arnold would have interacted with in St. Thomas. We don't have any of his letters that would have said what it was like guarding the town in St. Thomas, but I was able to find some details from local newspapers. And local newspapers at the time were wonderful in terms of personal details, right, and sharing, you know, the news of the town. And so, like, there was a lot of details about what these guys had to do actually before they left to go to Valcartier in Quebec.
And I feel like on my end, a lot of my process was sort of using the archival information that you've already provided, especially for this part, and taking that and trying to derive a narrative from it. And so it's sort of this like double process of like taking like a lot of the time very dry historical information, deriving a narrative from that, and then further from that, deriving a narrative from that in like imagery. But I think it's really great because graphic novels are like such a temporal art form, and I think it fits this story really well in particular. Because you have this sort of representation of time and of like small details of places.
Yeah, and I should say, I pass all of these materials on to Kasimir with the, the unintended expectation is that he just gets it, right? I've been trained as a historian. I've done history courses, and I send all of these pictures and articles, and like, oh, I found some new stuff. I got to send it to Kasimir so he has a better idea in terms of how to translate this into visual, but I forget sometimes that, I got to slow down myself, right? It's not just something people.
I don't know if we've told this one before, but I think one of the really funny examples was one of the early pages. You were talking about how Arnold worked as a fireman on trains. And what I didn't realize was that the connotation of fireman was not like fighting fires, but starting fires. And so I was like, wow, yeah, he was putting out fires. No.
Yeah, and to develop the tone, so I mean, not just the fireman, the job change or the connotation that we think fireman is, I had to actually take on a tone of how they spoke in 1914. So using the various vocabulary, and that takes reams of old St. Thomas Times and St. Thomas Journal newspaper reading to get a sense of how people either read a newspaper or may have talked as well, so that I could perhaps give Arnold that voice, not knowing how he actually spoke. But I thought this slide was really important because it gives you a sense of the potential cover that we're going to use, and that the actual title for the book comes from a newspaper article where Arnold was described as the most perfect specimen. So for anybody from Munsee, Delaware, apparently we are the most perfect specimens. But it gave Kasimir and I the ability to go, well, wait a sec. So if he's been declared that by a Canadian Army medical doctor, then clearly this guy has shoveled a lot of coal into a locomotive, and he's in probably the best shape of his life, right? So, I mean, kudos to Uncle Arnold. He's been called this. It comes back to bite him in the butt because people make fun of him after that in good-natured ways, right? Which, Kasimir was able to bring to life in terms of an artwork. But I just bring this to attention that, here's a fellow who's Indigenous being declared by a white Army doctor as the most perfect specimen in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So there's this fellow is very unique. He leads a very unique life. He seems to be able to work in both spheres. He's just an outstanding individual.
I think you were talking a little bit about tone, so I wanted to bring up, I think part of capturing the tone of this graphic novel for me has sort of been the idea of honoring Arnold Logan as the person he is and as like the story he has, but not necessarily like glorifying war in this way, and not glorifying the things that he had to go through, despite the fact that he, very clearly made the best of it and did an incredible job. And all of his letters seems very, very positive, which did sort of surprise me because I feel like not many people going to war as an 18-year-old would have been such great sports about it. But yeah, sort of despite, his tone, like making it very clear that this was sort of an 18-year-old who has been in many ways like mistreated by the country he is going off to serve.
So the first 100 sort of takes off of that original picture of the 100 people who are standing in front of the courthouse. And it's trying to understand from Arnold's eyes what he's seeing or what he's feeling. And it's one of sort of the first pieces in the actual story. So, there we go.
St. Thomas, August 1914. What excitement! We've been cheered on and shaken hands with the whole city, it seems. They are calling us the first 100, the first men in all of Canada to volunteer for the war. This is going to be some adventure. I must admit I'm nervous. We are going by train to a place in Quebec. I haven't traveled far from home, except with my work on the Père Marquette. Farthest I've been is Detroit. I worry that my family won't be there to see me off. Seems like the other boys have a cheering section to see them off. My dad is in Detroit right now, writing for the Free Press and working in a store. Alma, my sister, is preparing to go live with him. My brother Alonzo's in Wallaceburg working in a glass factory, and Willis is in Buffalo with the railway. I guess that's how it goes with families. We scatter to the wind. The boys are excited, talking about this great adventure. The hope is that we will make it to France before the whole thing is over. I must admit, it will be great to see the sights I've only seen in school books.
I think sort of adding on again to the tonal thing, like I wanted to make it very clear that like this was an 18-year-old and he's missing his family. And there's sort of the idea of like it's a little bit harder for him because a lot of these men that he's seeing have large families who are able to support them in that way. And so, yeah, I guess it's just like the idea of sensitivity. And I guess sort of because it's a narrative playing into like presumed ideas of what this person might be feeling.
I should mention that there's some fiction and nonfiction in this. So it's through family story that his father works in Detroit for the Free Press. I think to this point, we still haven't found any articles that Scobaia wrote to the Free Press, his dad. We do know that Alma went across to Detroit to become an actress because there's a record of that. We know that Alonzo works in Wallaceburg at the Dominion Glass Factory, and that Willis himself is working on the railway at the time. So there is a blend of what I've heard from family say, but also what records also has to say in this story. The picture to the left is of Arnold himself, probably taken just before he signed up or when he signed up. There's also a family photo of him and his sister Alma and his brother Alonzo, my great-grandfather. This is a particularly long clip, and just to set it up, this is actually when Arnold goes to Valcartier, Quebec for the training. So Valcartier in Quebec wasn't actually established, it was an established training base prior to 1914. So the Canadian Army had to rush and put it together for the hordes of people that were coming from Canada to sign up for 1914 and World War I. So it was kind of built on the fly. And because Arnold is one of the very first people to sign up for the war, he arrives to a Valcartier, Quebec that is still very much under construction. And they're living in tents as opposed to barracks, and they're being put to work. The St. Thomas crew are kept together, so he actually gets to stay with his group of friends. We found back in 1991, I had to go to the St. Thomas Library to look through the rolls. And that's why my eyes are no good anymore, right? Because you lose the ability to focus. But as much as you looked, and there wasn't an advanced searches, you just had to look through 1914, 1915, 1916 and hope that you found something. Whereas now we were able to look through the files and we were able to find a clear picture of Arnold with his tent mates at Valcartier holding a St. Thomas pennant. So it's these pieces that are really fun to find because, again, we've lost the photos of him in his army uniform. We lost all the letters of him, but to now find bits and pieces within newspapers to help recreate his story, which we don't have other than family story, you know, is very helpful, and it's that whole 35 years of starting a story and finding so much more, and then having to draw the line somewhere in terms of what you find. I'll click this, and then Kasimir and I can talk about this clip. It's fairly long, but it gives you an idea about the time at Valcartier.
So we've arrived in Valcartier. It looks to me like the Army built this camp just a few days prior to us arriving. There are tents everywhere, and men from many parts of Canada. I begin to understand that this is no small undertaking. Trains keep arriving, each crowded with soldiers. I must admit, I had a hard time sleeping that night. The boys from St. Thomas were able to stick together, and we have about 20 tents to keep us dry. I must admit, it's going to take some time getting used to sleeping on the ground. There is a rumor going around that we're going for medical inspection this week to make sure we can handle the rigors of Army life. We must also officially join the Army if we pass. I'll write soon and tell you how things went. Well, we've been here a couple of weeks, and we are starting to get to know how to be soldiers. If I had to be truthful, it looks like the Army wasn't really ready for us. The camp is busy with construction, building more permanent buildings to replace the thousands of tents. There's been a lot of marching around the camp, broken up with drill, learning the Ross rifle, and different tactics. More men arrive each day from all over Canada, thousands. Some are in uniform, some look like they just left their last job. There is rumor we won't enjoy the new camp and that we'll be leaving for England within the month. We have been assigned into different parts of the Army. Ernie and I have been assigned to the machine gun section, although we haven't touched one yet. The bunch of us thought it would be a great idea to pose for a picture and send it back home. One of the boys even brought a St. Thomas pennant with him. They're a great group. Lots of laughs and stories from back home in the railroad. Till next time.
So that sort of gives you an idea in terms of what Arnold sort of saw. And I forgot to mention that one piece that both myself and Kasimir were working with is that he has a best friend that he goes to war with, a really close friend named Ernie Biggs. And Ernie survived the war. He came back, he had lost eyesight and things like that, but he and Ernie write letters back through the St. Thomas Times-Journal to let everybody at home know what they've been up to, right? And so they talk about getting Mexican good luck charms. They talk about going to London and England and things like this. And, you know, Ernie, when Arnold passes, is sort of left to take those memories back home. And there is a family photo, a photo that many people have where Ernie's actually standing beside this tombstone out on the reserve. So Ernie came back to St. Thomas and was able to, you know, give the family the information. I think that might be it.
I think it's like adding on to that, I think it's very charming to see those like elements of like his personality poking through. And just these ideas of like, I was talking to Ian about this earlier, but this project has been really like moving to me because when I started it, or at least when I started doing revisions, I was around 18, 19, which was around the time that Arnold enlisted. And we both sort of have like these really strange coincidences of like, he has like a great connection to horses. I use horses as like a symbol in a lot of my work. He worked on boats for a good majority of his time in the Army, and I now also work on boats. And I suppose, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but the time that around the time we like wrapped work on the graphic novel, I was the same age as when he passed. So it's just been this sort of like, what I said to Ian was like this idea of history as conversation and connection rather than as like sort of a form of research. And so it's just been a really interesting like experience to be able to connect with this person who has zero overlap with my lifetime.
So we hope that in 2026 in November, the book will come out. Both Kasimir and I have no experience in creating a book. So we are discovering the publishing side of things and the amount of revisions that are needed. But we're working with a company that's very Indigenous focused, and they've sort of given us some guidance in terms of how to get everything ready for December of 2025 for next year's publication. And eventually, it will be in both languages, English and Munsee. Anishik, for your time.
Anishik, thank you so much for having me here.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm very excited for when your book comes out. Thank you both. Next up, we have Mary Jane McCallum of the Munsee Delaware Nation to talk about her recently published book, Brown Tom's School Days.
Quinganao Lomwa, Nidersinsi Mary Jane Logan McCallum, Nino Giai Nalahi, Shok Ni Wikion Winnipeg, Nin Lunaapeewak. And Ashik, all the thank yous to Suzanne for inviting me and the whole team for organizing this conference every year. It's something that I look forward to finding out how they're going to organize it every year. And a few other thank yous to the Munsee Delaware Nation. That should have a hyphen in it, shouldn't it? Apologies. I just got told this morning, too. Sorry, Jackie. Munsee Delaware Nation for sponsoring me through my entire post-secondary education. Munsee Delaware Language and History Group, which is inspiration for all kinds of projects ever since we started at the anniversary, 100-year anniversary of Arnold's death in 1916. Also the Library and Archives Canada, United Church Archives, the University of Winnipeg, and Trent University Archives, which are repositories that I used in order to find out more about the author and the book that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about a man named Enos Montour and his book, Brown Tom's School Days, about the time that he spent at Mount Elgin Industrial School near London, Ontario, in the early 20th century. So he attended at around the same time as my great-grandfather and Arnold, and perhaps Alma as well. So the book is especially important and interesting to me. Montour was a writer, and among other things, he wrote a history of Delaware at the Six Nations of the Grand River called the Feathered UELs, in which he uses quite a bit of Munsee language and tells really his own family history, but with pseudonyms. He uses pseudonyms for all his family members. It's now out of print, but it's still relatively easy to find compared to Brown Tom's School Days. I had known about this book from reading Elizabeth Graham's 1997 book called The Mush Hole, which was about Mount Elgin and the Mohawk Institute residential schools, which are the two oldest boarding schools in Ontario. It was also used in the 2015 final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which has already been brought up in this in the morning session. But attempts to locate the book over the years have been unsuccessful. The only copy I could locate was actually at the National Library in Ottawa, which is a non-lending library. So I asked a friend of mine who knew somebody who had made a copy of it for research they had done for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And sure enough, she found it, and it ended up in my Dropbox. So again, like these are these modern forms of research that we can do now that Ian couldn't do in the early 1990s. But this is, now I go like this. This is what it looks like at the archives. So it might not look like how you expect a book looks like, and more about that later. There's actually a lot of things about this book that are unusual for a book about residential schools. Enos started his book about Mount Elgin at the end of the story, when the main character, Tom Hemlock, and his friend were seniors at Mount Elgin Residential School. He also starts the book in a boat on the Thames River that he calls the Muskegon. He gives it a pseudonym as well. in a chapter called Chapter 1, Salad Days. On a warm June evening during the First World War, the Muskegon River flowed smoothly on its way to the Great Lakes. Its brown waters were littered with wisps of hay, interspersed with flower petals. Haying was in progress, and the rich lands that lined its banks. In the air, insects of various kinds, more visible at sundown, sang their adolescent songs. Butterflies had retired for the night, and it was still too early for the bothersome mosquito. Along the riverbanks, in the deep grass, cows stood, idly chewing their cuds after a day of luscious feeding. Their eyes were closed, as if reliving the day's perfection. Their tails swung, but slowly, at the few remaining flies. It was a scene of idyllic contentment. On the bosom of that slow-moving river in those horse and buggy days floated a flat-bottomed rowboat. It was painted a bright red with the word institution stenciled in white at its prow. In that boat, 2 teenage Ontario Indian boys reclined gracefully. They held school books in their brown hands, cramming for the June exams as the boat drifted down the slowly gurgling current. Okay, so to give you a sense of where they are here, hopefully you can see this map. We've got here, you can probably see 6 nations of the Grand River. So Enos Montour's from a part of that First Nation. And then to the left, further down, you've got the 3 Thames River communities, Oneida, Chippewas, and Munsee. And then I don't know if St. Thomas is actually, St. Thomas is in red just between the words Oneida of the Thames and Munsee Delaware Nation. That's what Ian was talking about earlier, St. Thomas. And London's to the north there. When my great-grandfather, Alonzo Logan, left Mount Elgin, he got married to a fellow Mount Elgin student from Walpole Island and worked at a glass factory, as Ian mentioned, in Wallaceburg, Ontario, later getting a job with a Père Marquette with his brother Arnold, and living in St. Thomas, Ontario. Arnold enlisted for service in the First World War and died in Ypres, Belgium, probably about 2 years after he left Mount Elgin. Their sister, Alma, moved to Detroit and worked there for most of her life, returning frequently to Munsee for visits with the family. It's a little bit more family history. But I was thinking about these things while I was reading this book, because Brown Tom Hanlock also talks about nearing the end of his time at Mount Elgin. And at that time, he was sure he wanted to stay in school. So this is a conversation he has in the book with his the senior class on a Sunday afternoon during visiting hours. "Look here, fellows," said Mitchell, "we must be serious. This may be the last chance we'll have together, and there's a lot to discuss. Our people are in bondage to the white man, and their rights are denied them. We, who have education, ought to help them. They ought to get back the land, the money, and rights that have been stolen from them. Listen, you high aimers," said Brown Tom. "Let me tell you my ambition. I'm staying with the books. The books have made me what I am. I want to get my matriculation and follow knowledge like a sinking star." And that's exactly what Enos Montour does. After he left Mount Elgin, he went to high school in Hagersville, and he later taught at a day school at New Credit. And during the war, he signed up for something called the Harvest Excursion, which was this train, organized train rides for young men and women to work out west in the farms, because there were a lot of people who had enlisted who were farmers and they needed farm help out west. And so he did that for a few years, and through Methodist connections out there, actually ended up attending McGill University, getting a Bachelor of Arts in 1927 and a Bachelor of Divinity in 1929. He was ordained as a United Church minister shortly after that, and he was placed for most of his career in white settler towns in southern Saskatchewan. Ceylon, St. Walburg, Hawarden, Elrose, Aneroid, Capel, and Colgate Goodwater. So these are towns that I have never heard of before, but are well known to people from southern Saskatchewan. He had a 6-year stretch at home at the Chapel of the Delaware in Six Nations. So he was not only a minister, but he's also a writer, writing for the newspapers in Ontario and Saskatchewan, the Brantford Expositor, the Hamilton Spectator, Regina Leader Post, and United Church of Canada periodicals as well. So I think I've managed to gather most of his writing, and we created a bibliography at the end of the book of all of his writing, in addition to Brown Tom's School Days. Okay, so Enos Montour wrote Brown Tom's School Days over the course of his adulthood. So he published early chapters of this book in United Church magazines. And then it was in his retirement, about the mid-1970s, that he set out to write the complete Brown Tom and what he called his final book. He sought out a publisher, first trying with the United Church Publishing House, and then with Gage, Clark, Irwin, and Dent, which were all kind of education publishers that were very popular Canadian publishers at the time, but was not able to garnish enough interest in his work. In his mind, he felt like he was getting turned down because his book didn't contain enough, and this is his quote, sex and 4-letter words. It was too mild and too innocent. Okay, so it was through a mutual friend, historian Donald Smith, who was at the University of Toronto at the time, that Enos was put in touch with Dr. Elizabeth Graham, again, the woman who wrote The Mush Hole in 1997. So at the time, she was working on developing history of Mount Elgin and the Mohawk Institute. And so she was interested in this history, and especially like in a firsthand, someone telling her exactly what happened while he was at the school. So she agreed to transcribe his book, and they still kept trying to get a publisher for the book, and his health began to fail, and he finally just asked Graham to photocopy it and be done with it. So this was in the mid-1980s, and so at that time, you took any photocopying that you had to do to a copy shop. So M&T Copier in Waterloo, Ontario, made the book. They made enough copies for relatives and some to sell to friends in the United Church. They had it bound with the plastic around the edge, and I'm thinking about those who are interested in the history of the book here. And then they distributed it. So the book, it was not professionally published, and this seems to be an important attribute just to consider for a minute. While Enos's deteriorating health ultimately forced his and Graham's decision to self-publish, the relationships that he had built with editors and academics had failed to yield encouragement from a publisher. So it's not like he didn't have connections. He was working every angle that he possibly could. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996 noted that it was nearly 60 years after poet Pauline Johnson's death in 1913 before Indigenous authors would reappear on Canada's literary scene. And so the next talk will be really interesting. I think that book was published in the United States as opposed to in Canada. So without the support and interest of a predominantly white publishing industry, Indigenous writers made their knowledge more widely available by self-publishing, limited-run, what's called gray literature, much of which, unfortunately, rather quickly became difficult to locate and access. So Brown Tom was published within what some literary experts have called printing cultures, as opposed to print culture, which is the kind of large-scale and authoritative public texts. So these are small-scale, localized. They serve the needs of particular families and individuals and audiences, but also were highly responsive to the lived realities of Indigenous expression within colonizing nations. So we do well when we're thinking about the literary and book history of Indigenous people to look for things in archives, that aren't officially published through mainstream kind of publishers, but are maybe, you know, in these very, very local archives, and don't really look like how you think a book might look like. So Enos Montour's writing is really unique. He drew heavily from biblical references and classical literature, and I'm not really that familiar with classical literature, so I had to look up a lot of these references, and there's a glossary at the back of the book. There's also like turn of the century music. He refers to songs, and you know, so many of these quotes are kind of peppered throughout his book, and a lot of them actually come from, oddly, stories that are found in the book on the left, the Ontario Reader's Third Reader. So I was looking through some of these old books that he might have been exposed to at Mount Elgin, and there were a lot of the stories that he refers to in the book that are actually in that reader. So I think that, you know, it's possible that he could have had something like that as a text at Mount Elgin, and it's really interesting to think about how he might have like brought in that knowledge, right? Those stories that he was reading in the text. So the title of the book itself, Brown Tom School Days, tips off readers that his writing would involve plays on classical mainstream literature taught at school. So you might already have been able to guess that Brown Tom School Days is a play on words of Tom Brown's School Days. So this is Thomas Hughes's 1857 classic. It depicts the life of an English boy at Rugby School, an elite private boarding school for older boys, and the birthplace of the game of rugby. So it is considered a founding text of muscular Christianity, the Victorian ideal that celebrated physical athleticism, patriotic duty, and self-sacrifice as appropriate characteristics of moral men. So Brown Tom marked the starting point of a school genre that became very, very popular in the English-speaking world. They're most commonly about English private schools, most commonly about boys. I think Harry Potter is sort of the more recent, famous one in that kind of genre. So Montour's Brown Tom and Hughes's Tom Brown have several similarities beyond the titles and institutional settings. Both combine fictional and non-fictional elements based on the author's experiences at school and cover themes of certain events, bullying, friendship, growing up, learning about one's position within a larger community. The title of Montour's book about an Ojibwe boy at Mount Elgin gives you a sense of the kind of brilliance of his writing. So you really, anybody who does have a sense of classical literature will get a lot out of this book. The title, my Indigenous Studies professor at Mac, Rick Montour, has observed, is a dad joke. It's a complete dad joke if you're, a dad from the 1960s, say, and went to school with these kinds of stories. It's a sense of humor that, for us, might be a few generations removed, but it remains remarkably familiar to me. As Enos Montour explained to one journalist in 1981, it's a play on words with an ethnic twist on the famous Tom Brown School Days. Today, I think it pokes holes in the false comparisons made by residential school denialists between boarding schools and Indian residential schools. So there's a lot of satire and irony in the book. The book also deals with very real places and real events, the real barn of Mount Elgin, the real buildings, real hunger, real staff who worked there who are named, real farm animals, real fire that happens at the school, the real war that unfolded while he was there, and real death that happened at Mount Elgin. The word Sunday cake is mentioned 11 times, hungry 16 times, food is mentioned 26 times, bread in particular 26 times, turnip 7 times, mush 36 times. It gives you a fulsome depiction of hunger and homesickness. But it's reticent about other really unsightly and serious problems that were going on at the time at Mount Elgin. So he writes, the students, for the most part, are a healthy-looking group, although some smaller lads suffered from skin diseases and chapped hands. So later he reports lice using the only Delaware word in the book, wheelpish, and only as a metaphor. And it's also removed from him, like he kind of uses it as something that's happening elsewhere. We know, in reality that these are really impoverished institutions that were, full of disease. And there is one chapter that's devoted to a boy who dies of tuberculosis in Mount Elgin. And it's a really kind of oddly distant story. He says, occasionally the silent killer, TB, showed up amongst the enrollment. Some quiet, inoffensive lad would grow unusually quiet and listless. One such victim was young Noah. He would be found sitting alone down by the riverside pretending to fish. But his mind was clouded with many questions and doubts. He would remember how prone Indian people were to get TB. He had seen white isolation tents standing outside the homes of sick people. Even the white people who worked at the stone quarry sometimes had such tents. As he tied an extra hook to the fish line, and his memory floated back to the Sunday school lesson, as prone as the sparks to fly upward. The whirls of institution life went on around him, the pairs who went to the village for feasts, the love notes passing across the great gulf, apple stealing, the fist fights, and the passing of Sunday cake to pay a debt. All this went on and more, but Noah kept his thoughts to himself and avoided getting involved in any of these things. Finally, he reported sick. The concerned matron bustled around, taking his temperature and cooking special soups. When the principal walked by, he took one look and said to Miss McTaggart, "We'd better call Dr. Holmes. This could be serious." "You mean," she said. "Yes," said the principal. "I mean just that, TB." As his creeping insidious disease came over him, he began to lose interest in all boyish activity. He coughed frequently and his energy was sapped away. His chums tried to interest him in their games and outings, but he only smiled wanly and told him to leave him out. He didn't feel like it. Soon after this, Noah was taken away from the institution quietly, and emptiness remained where the gentle boy had lived with his pals. So it's not clear in Montour's writing if Noah was taken away home to a hospital or if he had died, but the title of the chapter is called The Happy Hunting Ground for Noah. So that tells us it's the latter. In the recent report on residential school deaths and burials, associated with Indian residential schools, this is helpful in interpreting this brief and reticent discussion of Noah's illness and death. So the report uses this term ungrievability to understand widespread apathy and indifference towards the deaths and burials of students at Indian residential schools. And expressions of grief about student deaths were denied. They found that people reported that, knowing about deaths and feeling sad about deaths were denied at Indian residential schools, though through the failure to communicate information about the deaths with the students and to their families. So there's a dehumanization that was vehemently resisted by First Nations, and outside the purview of the students, in Mount Elgin's written record, there were many complaints lodged by students and band councils about the impacts of poor nutrition, contagious disease, and overwork, as well as inadequate medical care and overall neglect faced by the children. And so there's many, really interesting themes that come up in this book. I've ended up kind of going down a stream looking at the history of the institution I'm teaching at right now, the University of Winnipeg, which was also a school for a theological college in its early days, and its connection to residential schools in Manitoba. So I have a couple of those schools, but you can tell they kind of look similar in some ways to Mount Elgin. These are all institutions either where, of First Nations children in boarding schools, and then, the training schools of missionaries who ended up, some of them ended up working in them. And a few Indigenous people ended up going to them. So I think I probably hit my time. So I want to just say thanks very much for listening to this. The book was kindly redone in a second edition by the University of Manitoba Press with an introduction by me, and then a new preface by Elizabeth Graham, and then his two grand editors write an epilogue at the end. So great, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, we would like to welcome John Nicholas of the Munsee Delaware Nation on his parents' book, Cry of the Ancients. Thank you. Yes.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Anishik for inviting me to be a part of the program. You have to forgive me a little bit because for me personally, it was quite an experience to meet so many Indians, so many Munsees at one time. Here I am standing up in front of you to talk about Indians. Back in 1973, my mother and father published a book entitled Cry of the Ancients. You see the front cover here. The illustrations in the book were done by my brother, Daniel. So it was, in every aspect, a product of love and family contribution. I didn't want to tell you much about what the book is about, but to give you a sense of the flavor of it. I wanted to read the first chapter, which was written by my father. But before I do, to give you a sense of who he was, go to the next. How do I do that?
Oh, sorry. There, so you can
Yeah.
just click
Oh, okay.
that one there.
My mother and father, Harvey Nicholas and Clara Nicholas, he was known as Gray Owl, and she was his little pigeon. And two lovebirds. Together had raised 14 children, of which I'm the last of two. Well, my twin brother and I, the last of 14. The first chapter of the book is entitled The Call. Again, I won't go through the whole book with you, but I'll give you a sense of what the book is about. My father wrote the first chapter, after which he passed away in 1959. And what he said, these are his words: "For what, my people, do we hunger? When the stranger offers us bread, why do we turn on him in bitter pride and cry, 'It is a stone, away with it'? When one comes fawning and says insidiously, 'Oh, I know the Indian and his glory, how he could ride and fight and hunt, how cunning on the trail of his enemy, how canny his nature lore, how true and enduring his friendship. What is this reticence that lifts our heads and whispers in our hearts, you never knew us?' And those who come wringing their hands, crying aloud the guilt of their ancestors for taking the lands of the first and true Americans, why do we stiffen and draw back from their vain apologies? What is this faint stirring of grief, this half-forgotten memory of something infinitely more precious than the land? Think, my brothers, and remember, Open your eyes, old ones, and wake from your dreaming. Wake and remember your fathers and the true glory of your past. Do not stop with history books where one man's opinion caught your people in a small moment and left you there impaled upon a fragment of time. Back, beyond the wars and the hatred and the hunger. Back, beyond the days of your wanderings, when your instinct for survival made you the greatest naturalists of all the world. Back, into the farthest reach of legend. Pause and listen with your heart. For I say to you, my brothers, the greatness of the Indian was not that he held the land and roamed free. Today, other men hold that land and freedom. Yet they often envy and seek that peculiar something that has kept your spirits free and proud. Neither was the glory of the Indian his wild racing of ponies across the plains, nor the deftness of canoe paddles on the white water. Come, my brothers, let us open the door to memory, but carefully, for beyond is a glory blinding in its truth. I call to you, Lakota, whom men call by another name. Whence came you when you drove your laden canoes up the Mississippi and its tributaries? From the south you came, you people of the serpent, and to the south returned and came again. I call to you, Shawnee. Ask of your old men, were their fathers not in Florida when the white men first entered the land? And were they not then resting from their migrations from farther south and west? I call to you, Oneida, you people of the Standing Stone. Search your legends and traditions. Trace your generations back from New York through the rich Ohio country and its mounds, down the Mississippi and its valleys to the great Gulf. Follow its curve and find the land of the Standing Stone and your glory. Chickasaw, well you know of your beginnings and the dream that brought you safely from the land of sunset. All you nations, search your legends, for they hold the key that can give you back what no man can promise you, no matter how great his sincerity or how rich his purse. Open the door and find your identity as a nation of people. Come to the remembrance of your fathers. Look upon Tula the Golden and the days of your innocence. For in those days, the great chief of heaven spoke to us, the gay and the beautiful, the laughing, industrious, rejoicing, adventuring sons of the land, and called us his children. He sent his beloved, the morning star, the healer, to teach us to live in love together. Where are the old ones who could tell of our downfall in those ancient days? In the fair land where the bounties of the Supreme Being were spread for all men, jealousy, greed, and suspicion possessed the people until each man's hand was lifted against his neighbor, and the land became one vast battlefield. And the great Father of all looked upon his children with sadness, and the prophecy was given. This is my fair land. With my hands and my heart have I made it, and it is dearer to me than all the lands of earth. If you cannot live by my laws, sharing in the gifts that I have given, then I will cause such enemies as you have never seen to come upon you, and they will put their feet upon your necks and grind your faces in the dust. But there was a promise too, remember? Some far day, you will begin to lift your heads, and you will climb to the mountain and lift your arms, saying as one voice, Father, we are here, and I will remember. Now, as a people, we are called to awaken. But one man says, come this way, and another that way. Come into the light of civilization, says one. Learn to fight for your rights, and take as other men do. No, said another, you're prettier if you stay in the teepee. Tan your own leather and make fire with sticks. Which shall we choose, my brothers, as we come into the promise? First, let us strip away the clutter that the storybooks have included about our past, for this is wisdom. If you lose all you have, your wealth, your country, your hopes, and may keep a secure knowledge of yourself and your worth as a link in the chain of life, you have a rock to build upon. If all things are added to you, wealth, position, fame, and power, but you have not the anchor of your heritage, you are as an empty canoe upon the waters of life. So let us, with our memories, first seek our heritage, our lovely past. I have a little knowledge. You, my brothers, have more. Let us lift our heads and our voices, for it is time. Signed, Gray Owl.
Thank you very much. I hope there's an audiobook and you read it. Next up, I'm pleased to welcome John Moses, the Delaware and Upper Mohawk Band's Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, to talk about a Six Nations Delaware literary history. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation as such. I'm just going to be speaking here from the podium and hopefully thereby avoid any technical glitches and that kind of thing. But I do want to give you an example or a couple of examples of writing by or about our small mixed Munsee-Mohican band of Lenape at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Our people, of course, as you all know, were disrupted and dispersed very early on. We were on the move westward by, the late 1600s, and our first colonial encounters were with the Dutch and the Swedes and the English. Currently, there are Lenape communities to be found as far afield as, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, Kansas, and at least 3 communities in southern Ontario comprising Munsee Delaware First Nation, Moraviantown, and our small mixed band of Munsee-Mohican Delaware descendants at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. But first, consistent with traditional protocols around the Grand River country anyways, I did want to take this opportunity to introduce myself in some detail, just so that you know exactly who I am and where I'm from. Again, my name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario. That's where both my parents were born and raised, and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. Through my mother, we still have 50 acres of farmland on Third Line, up and down Third Line Road, also called Delaware Line at Six Nations, that we continue to farm. My late father, Russ Moses, was a residential school survivor of the Mohawk Institute, a naval veteran of the Korean War, an Air Force veteran of the Cold War, and an accomplished public servant whose various roles included playing a leadership role in the development and delivery of the Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal. And that pavilion today is increasingly recognized as a real watershed in Indigenous self-representation before national and global audiences. My mother, Helen Montour Moses, who's 95 now, member of the Upper Mohawk Band at Six Nations, followed her own mother, Edith Anderson Montour, the Great War U.S. Army nurse and Canadian Indigenous healthcare pioneer, into the nursing profession. And Helen was a founding member of the original Canadian Indian Nurses Association in the 1970s, for which work she received her Eagle Feather. So I'm just telling you all of this so you know exactly who I am and where I'm coming from in all respects, and what informs my values and opinions on different matters. Now, the unique history of our mixed Munsee-Mohican band of Lenape at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory in southwestern Ontario, Canada, is recounted in sources comprising the Delaware Idol, published in 1913 by noted Mohawk poet, essayist, and short story writer Pauline Johnson. The Celestial Bear Comes Down to Earth, the bear sacrifice ceremony of the Munsee-Mohican in Canada, is related by Nakatsit, published in 1945 by anthropologist Frank Speck and my great-uncle Jess Moses. And then finally, my own late father, Russ Moses' residential school memoir, which has been published most recently under the title of This Is Not My Story But Yours, the Russ Moses Residential School Memoir. Written in 1965, this last work recounts the conditions that Russ, whose dates were 1932 to 2013, encountered and endured during his childhood years spent at the infamous Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School, also called the Mush Hole, under exceptionally severe wartime and post-war conditions from 1942 to 1947. Now, it's important to consider that 3 generations of the Moses family attended the Mohawk Institute under varying conditions during the decades spanning the 1880s to the 1940s. My great-grandfather Nelson Moses was there in the 1880s. My grandfather Ted Moses was there in the 19-teens during the years of the First World War. And then my father Russ was there, as I say, at the height of the Second World War and in the post-war era from 1942 to 1947. Now, Pauline Johnson's short story, The Delaware Idol, and I did bring some visual aids. This is the first edition of a collection of Pauline Johnson short stories called the Shagnappy, published in 1913, and The Delaware Idol is one of the short stories contained in this anthology. Sorry, I just lost my place here. This provides a description of the conditions under which the Munsee-Mohican band of Lenape at Six Nations of the Grand River underwent a forced religious conversion in about the year 1850. And essentially, the Delaware Idol it's a lightly fictionalized account of the circumstances under which Pauline Johnson's own father, a religious zealot by the name of George Johnson, launched a violent axe attack upon the structure and furnishings of the Six Nations Delaware Big House, resulting in the group's forced religious conversion, while the Celestial Bear, a copy of which I have here, published in 1945, provides an oral history of our band based on testimonies that were collected by Frank Speck with the assistance of Jess Moses throughout the 1920s, 30s, and into the 1940s. Now, to quote at length from our own ethno-history, The Celestial Bear, as to the particular origins of our composite Munsee band of Lenape at the Six Nations of the Grand River, I'll just quote directly from certain relevant passages that really provide the genesis of how our particular group came to be settled amongst the Haudenosaunee community that otherwise comprises the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. So, quoting from the book itself, it's important to the question of the makeup of the band studied that Mr. Jess Moses' great-grandfather, Julia Highcomb, or Icom, was a Mohican who lived amongst the Delawares because she could speak their language. As Mr. Moses had been told, she was born at Old Oneida, New York. Her son was Moses Cornelius, also called Cornelius Moses, the last who carried the identity of the Mohican and Pequot linguistic legacy in the Six Nations Delaware. He was born near Dunnville, Ontario, and considered himself to be of Pequot descent, which dialect he spoke. From the discussion which has just been given, I believe it is evident that we have in the Ohsweken Delaware Band, domiciled for almost 2 centuries with the Six Nations, a group of co-residents blended and fused into a political unit derived from Mohican, Munsee, and Pennsylvania Delawares proper. The ethnic derivation just pointed out traces the descent from tribes closely related in their original cultural properties and close enough in their idioms of the Algonquin language to have been mutually communicable. We have written and oral testimony concerning the Six Nations Delaware to conclude that they resisted conversion until about 1850, until which time they retained their original form of worship in ritual and in belief. In short, I would pronounce that the band in question to represent the conservative, unconverted family elements in the Munsee and Mohican territories of the Hudson River Valley and southern New York, from the Mohawk River to the upper Delaware River Valley, respectively. These bands were augmented in the course of their migrations to the protective embrace of the non-Christian Cayuga by similarly non-Christian families of Unami Delawares from that region of Pennsylvania, lying to the north of Philadelphia in the valley of the Delaware, to the borders of the Munsee country as they stood in the mid-18th century. So what we've just seen described here basically is the westward migration over time of various refugee bands of Algonquin-speaking groups from the New England states across middle New York State and making their way due west almost, eventually winding up at Buffalo, New York, then crossing over to Fort Niagara, which in the few years following the end of the American Revolution was essentially a large refugee camp of Six Nations and other allied Indian nations who had fought with the British at the time of the American Revolution, and eventually occupying the Grand River Tract, which in its original dimensions spanned 6 miles deep along the banks of the Grand River on each shore from its mouth to its source. And the reserve as it exists today is a mere postage stamp in relation to that much larger original tract of land. And our group, the mixed Munsee-Mohican band of Lenape at Six Nations, were allowed to settle at Grand River essentially under the sponsorship of the Cayuga, and they took us in under their wing. Now, given my own family historical and genealogical research over many years now, and taking into account the unique opportunities and advantages afforded me by my own career over the years in the museums and heritage field and in the archival field, I've not to this point encountered any evidence to contradict or modify the accounting of my family's Six Nations Lenape heritage as provided in The Celestial Bear Comes Down to Earth. So I would recommend this to your attention if you're interested in finding out more about our small band at Six Nations. I would refer you to The Celestial Bear Comes Down to Earth, and that's available. All of these sources, whether we're talking about the Russ Moses Residential School memoir, the Pauline Johnson short story, The Delaware Idol, or The Celestial Bear, they're all available online on various sources. Now, in order to give you some appreciation, as I say, of the circumstances under which our band underwent, I would have to say at the very least, a coerced, or if not forced, religious conversion in 1850 from traditional Lunaape big house ceremonialism and spirituality to the embrace of various Protestant religious denominations. I'm going to quote at length from the short story, The Delaware Idol. As I say, this occurred in 1850. The short story makes use of various pseudonyms. So when I refer to the character known as Wampum, that's actually the pseudonym that Pauline Johnson assigned to her own father, George Johnson. And the Anglican church missionary is referred to the pseudonym of Reverend Mr. James Nelson, and there's also a Mohawk elder identified as Fireflower. Now, it's important to note that this story is footnoted as follows by Pauline Johnson herself, and I quote, "This tale is absolutely true. The writer's father was the boy who destroyed the Delaware Idol, the head of which is at this time one of the treasures in the family collection of Indian relics and curiosities." And that actually resides today at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. So anyways, quoting at length from the short story itself, "And where do you go now, young Wampum?" asked Fireflower. "I'm to drive to the missionary, the Reverend Mr. Nelson's today. He goes to the Delaware line once more." "Ha, the Delaware," sneered old Fireflower. "I like not those Delawares. They worship idols. It is not good to dance around idols." Said Wampum, "I don't like their hideous idol either, and someday I hope to see it cut down," he added earnestly. Wampum was a great friend of Mr. Nelson, the missionaries. He was only a boy of 16, but helped in all the church work, translated Mr. Nelson's sermons from English into Mohawk and various other dialects spoken on the reserve, drove him through the rough forest roads, paddled him down the Grand River, and was the closest companion the good missionary had in all that wild, remote country. Even Wampum's own parents were Christian church workers, but kindly as their hearts were, they too shook their heads sorrowfully over the hopelessness of trying to Christianize the dark, idol-worshipping Delawares. Long before they reached the Delaware line, Wampum and Nelson could hear the sounds of feasting and dancing. It was growing dark, and the great heathen ceremonies were at their height. Many a time had the good missionary attended these dances, always putting in a good word for Christianity whenever a fitting opportunity occurred, always hoping that the day would come when the hideous idols would be laid low and these darkened souls brought to the light of the world. And then fast forward to the main part of the action. Suddenly, the great Delaware idol was there in all its hideousness, life-size in the form of a woman and carved from one solid block of wood, then painted and stained in the Indian copper color. It stood on a slight elevation in the center of the big log building. Wampum hated the thing and found it difficult not to hate those people who worshipped it. His own ancestors had been pagans, but never heathen. They had worshipped a living God, not a wooden one. The boy turned in sadness and some horror from the spectacle of the idolatrous Delawares. Suddenly the boy whirled his axe and brought it down crashing with full force on the idol. The neck was severed and the painted wooden head rolled ingloriously to the floor. And that's the end of the account of the axe attack upon the last Delaware big house, Lunaape big house, at the Six Nations, the Grand River Territory. And as I say, this ancestor continues to reside today as part of the Evelyn Johnson bequest at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And again, consistent with Pauline Johnson's own footnote, this account is an accurate record of what transpired, and that led to the forced or the coerced religious conversion of the Munsee-speaking band of Lunaape at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory in about 1850. Now, finally, I'm going to quote from the Russ Moses Residential School memoir, published most recently in Behind the Bricks, The Life and Times of the Mohawk Institute, Canada's longest-running residential school. This is the publication right here. It's hot off the presses. It was publicly released actually just as of September 30th. So less than a month ago, September 30th in Canada is National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And the Russ Moses Residential School memoir is published in its entirety in sort of facsimile reproduction. So just as the typewritten manuscript appears, that's what the reader sees upon making use of the volume. It's 17 chapters altogether, each one of which comprises a different aspect of life at the Mohawk Institute or the Mush Hole. It was in operation in one form or another from 1830 until 1970, so that gives it the unique distinction or the dubious distinction of being the longest running Indian residential school in Canada, so spanning some 140 years. So this captures in microcosm the role of the residential schools in halting the transmission of Indigenous cultures, heritage, and languages, and is the definition, I would suggest, of cultural genocide in action. Again, it is important to note that Russ was the third consecutive generation of the extended Moses family to attend the Mohawk Institute from the 1880s through the 1940s time period. So this is just one small quote. Russ's original memoir itself, it's 6 pages altogether, and if you're able to track down the book, you can order it through your independent booksellers. You can order it online through Barnes & Noble here in the States or Amazon. And the complete text, if you do a Google search and go to the publisher, University of Calgary, the complete text is available online free of charge. However, if you do want to get the actual book itself, you can order it as I've just described. So anyways, this is Russ from his memoir. Religion was pumped into us at a fast rate, chapel every evening and church twice on Sundays. For some years after leaving the Institute, I was under the impression that my tribal affiliation was Anglican rather than Delaware. This situation divides the shame amongst the churches, the Indian Affairs branch, and the Canadian public. When I was asked to do this paper, I had some misgivings, for if I were to be honest, I must tell you of things as they were, and really this is not my story, but yours, end of quote. So I'll just leave it there. So if you're interested in learning more about our Munsee-speaking band of Delaware at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, by all means, please look up The Delaware Idol by Pauline Johnson, The Celestial Bear Comes Down to Earth by Frank Speck and Jess Moses, and the Russ Moses Residential School memoir as published in Behind the Bricks. So thank you. Anoushik.